Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katerina Pasadomo. I teach here in Southern Studies and in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you about a few upcoming events, which Afton has helpfully linked in the chat. So first is this Sunday, October 15th, the Center for the Study of Southern Culture is partnering with the Sarah Isom Center for Women and Gender Studies, the Southern Documentary Project, and the Yoknapatawpha Arts Council to present the SarahFest Punk Pop-Up. It will feature a screening of a film by Center alum Christina Huff and a punk concert by Big Clown, which maybe you're cooler than me and know who that is. It is not a big clown, I'm assured. The event will take place on the Grove stage starting at 6 p.m. And then next Wednesday, October 19th, we have another virtual event at noon. This will be a conversation between Honor College Dean and Professor of English and African American Studies, Ethel Scurlock, and Disha Philyaw, author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Their conversation will explore the significance of race in the book's stories. Okay, now it is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Angel Adams Parham is Associate Professor of Sociology and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Dr. Parham is the author of American Roots, Racial Palimpsests and the Transformation of Race, which examines changes in race and racialization in New Orleans under the French, Spanish, and Anglo-American administrations. The book has earned numerous awards from the Social Science History Association and various sections of the American Sociological Association. In addition to this research, Dr. Parham is active in public-facing teaching and scholarship, where she provides training for K-12 educators who are looking to better integrate Black writers and Black history into their teaching. Her talk today is co-sponsored by the envisioned University of Mississippi Center for the Study of Race and Racism, and is titled Region, Race, and History, Racial Palimpsests in the Southern US. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Parham to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Katerina. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for the warm welcome and the generous introduction. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. Is that good? Everyone can see? Excellent. Okay. Wonderful. So yes, indeed, I will be speaking to you on the topic of region, race, and history. And I will be coming back to this term racial palimpsest and explaining what that is momentarily. So it all begins by looking at migration from colonial Saint-Domingue to Louisiana. And colonial Saint-Domingue was previously, well, it is now known as Haiti. It was previously Saint-Domingue, just to make that clear. And what happens is that as a result of revolution in what is present-day Haiti, you get a very large migration of people coming into New Orleans. And what you see here is an American administrator. So this is shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, who is reflecting on those who are streaming in. Upon what footing will the free quadroon, mulatto, and Black people stand? Will they be entitled to the rights of citizens or not? They are a numerous class in this city, say 1/3 or 1/4 of the population, many very respectable, and under this government enjoy their rights in common with other subjects. It is worth consideration of government. They may be made good citizens or formidable abettors of the Black people, say slaves, if they should ever be troublesome. So to give a little bit of background, the Haitian Revolution breaks out in 1791. And as a result of that, there are several waves of migration of refugees leaving colonial Saint-Domingue. Some of them go next door to Eastern Cuba, some go to Jamaica, and some come to different parts of the United States. So excuse me, also in 1803, you get the takeover of the Louisiana Territory, which of course is much bigger than the current state of Louisiana. It's the large swath through the middle of the country. And so this happens in 1803. So there's a lot going on socially and politically during this time. January 1st, 1804 is the Declaration of Haitian Independence. So the revolution is over, the people of Haiti are victorious, but the waves of migration continue to play out over the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas. So there was a very large group that went to Eastern Cuba. And the reason they went to Eastern Cuba is because it gave them a nearby perch from which to see what was going on with the revolution. Would they be able to go back and reclaim their property? So once the independence happens, it's clear that that's not going to happen for most of them. So those who are in Eastern Cuba settle down, or at least they think they're settling down, until 1809, when Napoleon Bonaparte puts his brother on the Spanish throne. This becomes a problem for the refugees coming from colonial Saint-Domingue, because of course they are French-speaking, French-identified, and the French are not really in the favor of the Spanish at this point, right? And Cuba is Spanish. And so they have to get out of town very, very quickly. In reading their accounts, they are desperate to leave, just throwing whatever they can into the boat. So they are effectively being made refugees a second time within just a few years of having fled the Haitian Revolution. So there's a rather large contingent that comes into New Orleans 1809 to 1810. And many people don't know nothing about this big migration. I didn't know anything about it until I started doing this research. So what you see on the chart here are the numbers in 1806 before they got there, the numbers of the refugees, and then the new numbers after they settle in. So if you look at this here, Orleans Parish, so in the parentheses, I note that the more concentrated urban area near what is the French Quarter and the environs right around the French Quarter, so not kind of the other outerlying areas of Orleans Parish, that urban population was only about 10,000 people when these refugees came in. It was about a third white, about a third free people of color, largely mixed race, and about a third enslaved people. But together, they nearly doubled the urban population of New Orleans. And you'll see that they were also a very, very large number of free people of color, right? And so you got more than a doubling of that population. And that becomes very, very significant as Anglo-Americans who have just taken over the territory in 1803 are trying to culturally and socially and politically administer this new territory. This group of free people of color is going to be very problematic to them. So what you effectively get, I argue, is a racial palimpsest, especially because this migration is so big. So what is a palimpsest? It is basically a parchment or other kind of writing surface, or it could be a canvas of a painting where you've got a foundational layer and then another layer is put on top of it. But that next layer does not completely obscure the first layer. So you can see the first layer kind of bleeding up through the top layer. So it's this kind of multi-layered situation with a palimpsest. So a racial palimpsest then is a social and sometimes a political situation where a pre-existing racial system is almost fully eclipsed by a new racial system that comes into place as the population that lives according to a different racial logic begins to numerically or administratively dominate a region. And so this is why I was putting so much emphasis on that group of free people of color who came through. So the Anglo-Americans who had just taken over Louisiana are coming with an Anglo-American understanding of how to do race. Those who came from colonial Saint-Domingue via Eastern Cuba are coming from what I kind of collapse into this larger category of a Latin Caribbean racial system. And I say collapse because there's a lot of diversity across Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of doing race, but they are all more similar in the way they do race than they are different when it comes to comparing them to the United States, which is why I separate them out this way. So the Anglo-American racial system, whiteness is determined by this idea of purity. And so one can only really be considered white if one has no kind of mixture in their background, and even going back for generations. Even if one looks white, historically, the way of defining and categorizing whiteness was that you couldn't have anything, quote unquote, impure or non-white, non-European in your background. Whereas in many Latin American and Caribbean systems, it's based more on appearance and not so much on this kind of ancestral purity. African ancestry in the Anglo-American racial system, there is a binary logic. So any amount of apparent African ancestry makes one Black and not white. Whereas in the Latin Caribbean system, you often get a tripartite or a continuum-based system where there are many different ways of categorizing people of African ancestry. It's not just Black, it could be many things. So in a tripartite system, you have white, people of color who are mixed race, and then Black. In a continuum system, you could have dozens of categories of people based on skin tone, hair texture, facial features, and so on. So there are many different ways of categorizing someone of African ancestry. So that's a really kind of just quick way of thinking about these two different racial systems. And so the palimpsest aspect occurs because New Orleans was originally under the French and the Spanish, which operated according to a Latin Caribbean system. Then you get the Louisiana Purchase, the Anglo-Americans come in to govern. They try to bring with them this Anglo-American racial system, but that then they run into trouble in New Orleans with this migration, because this migration reinforces that first Latin Caribbean racial system. So conceptually, part of what is central to my argument is that the racial palimpsest concept is a better concept for thinking about several parts of the United States, and that we need to have more historiographies or more historical work on non-European peoples migrating, especially in large numbers, to parts of the US and particularly to the South. And so this is analytically, this is related to the ways that sociologists tend to think about migration today. So the kind of dominant way of thinking about migration in sociology is to say, okay, if we're trying to understand groups of people who are coming and migrating to the country today from Latin America and the Caribbean, the historical cases that we're going to look at are going to be historical cases involving Europeans in the 19th and maybe the early 20th century. And so then the question is set up, oh, so, you know, to what extent are these newer immigrants, often of color, similar to or different from those 19th century European immigrants? The problem with that is that because of the way race is done in the United States, and it's done in a very distinctive way, when you are doing that kind of analysis, you're missing a lot of the significance of race. And so with the racial palimpsest concept, race is baked into the concept and baked into the historical case study, in contrast to kind of classic and contemporary assimilation theories in sociology, which are built on the experience of people of European descent, many of whom came and were not immediately considered to be white, and who became white or were reclassified as white over several generations. That's often considered to be the normative experience that people of color are compared to, whereas what I'm arguing is that you really need non-European, historical non-European cases to compare today's people of color to. It's also a corrective to a very nation-state centered analysis of race and racialization, which only thinks in terms of what is normative in the United States, more and more as people are coming from parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, they're also bringing their ways of doing race with them. And so a racial palimpsest concept allows us to kind of allow for that dynamism, that the way that race is done and understood in Miami, for instance, is going to be different than the way it's understood in Nevada, different from the way it's understood in New Orleans. When you have places that are kind of on territorial or water borders and barriers with Latin America and the Caribbean, you're going to get some interplay between those places in terms of how people think about and do race. And so these are some of the reasons I argue that this palimpsest concept is particularly useful. So just to try to continue to kind of draw this contrast in terms of the way race was done, in colonial Saint-Domingue, the refugees and the people who came over had this very interesting way of thinking about race. And I also include Louisiana here under the French and the Spanish. So there were defined social spaces for free people of color. In colonial Saint-Domingue, you had what was called the ménagère. And the ménagère was a woman who formed a partnership with a white man. And so this was a woman of color, often mixed race, and she would have contractually defined rights within that relationship. So there would be a notice of, what property she brought into the relationship, what kinds of benefits she could expect to get out of this partnership. So it wasn't marriage, but it was a kind of contractual understanding. In colonial Saint-Domingue and Louisiana, there was this more informal idea of the placé. So a woman of color, free woman of color, often mixed race, forming an informal partnership with a white man. And there was an informal, not contractual understanding that he would take care of her, pay for her housing, take care of any children who came out of the union. All right. And in both Louisiana and Saint-Domingue, there was a triracial system of whites at the top of the hierarchy, free people of color in the middle, and enslaved people at the bottom of the system who were less likely to be mixed race. On the Anglo-American side, you had a very limited social and legal space for free people of color. So you didn't have these different kind of categories or somewhat recognized social arrangements. Of course, you had interracial mixing, but it was less likely for white men to formally or even informally recognize those unions or the children from those unions. And you had a binary racial system. So these are the differences between the two racial systems, and it gives you a sense of some of the social ramifications of those differences. So let's think about what this palimpsest looked like over time in Louisiana. So 1718 to 1803, you have alternately French and Spanish rule, and a Latin Caribbean system, the triracial version. 1803 signals the beginning of the Louisiana Purchase. Until 1852, Anglo-Americans rule, and they begin to introduce the Anglo-American system, but it's kind of slow to really take off. The Latin Caribbean system is still dominant. And then in 1852, you get the kind of decisive Anglo-American rule. So there had been a time in 1836, I think I have that date right, I might need to confirm. In 1836, the city of New Orleans broke up into 3 municipalities. So 2 of those were French Creole, so the people who had been there under the French and the Spanish, and then the 3rd municipality was Anglo-American. And it was at the instigation of the Anglo-Americans that these 3 municipalities split up because they felt like they couldn't prosper. They didn't like the French and Spanish systems. And what happened is that the Anglo-Americans became economically much more successful than the French and the Spanish, the 2 Creole municipalities. And by 1852, when they reunited the city, they had become politically and economically dominant. And so that's why I date that 1852 is where the Anglo-American system rises to dominance through 1896. And then 1896 signals it becoming absolutely dominant. 1896 is the date of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which declares that separate but supposedly equal is legal. And it's at that time in the late 19th century, then you get, kind of this whole fleshing out and sorting out of people who had been, they were people of color of African descent, but they didn't necessarily identify as Black because they were coming from this other kind of French and Spanish system. And so I'll get into what did that, how did they kind of adapt themselves to or not to this Anglo-American system that kind of collapsed all people of African descent into one category. Then 2000 to the present, something very interesting has been happening, is the Anglo-American system is still dominant, but from the beginning of the 2000s, there have been increasing numbers of Creole of color organizations, and these are the descendants, many of them, of free people of color, who are starting to kind of think more about that identity and to really organize cultural and genealogical associations and becoming more vocal about claiming or reclaiming a Creole identity, which really fits more with the kind of French and Spanish ways of thinking about race and culture. So that gives us a sense of kind of how the layers of the palimpsest have come together in Southern Louisiana. So now what I want to do is to kind of talk about from the position of white Louisianans who would have identified as being Creole in the 19th century compared to people of color who would also have identified as being Creoles. That's Creole speaking, Catholic, also speaking French. So these two groups, the bulk of the research that I did in that book was to look at how those two different groups, whites and people of African descent who were Creole, how did they adapt themselves to this Anglo-American system becoming more and more dominant? And it affected them in very different ways. So for white Creoles, they were under pressure because the Anglo-Americans often thought of them when they came in the early 19th century as being, they thought, there's a lot of racial mixing going on in this area. People say they're white, but are they really white? Because, you have white men who are claiming these relationships with women of African descent and who are recognizing their children, sending their sons to France to educate them. And so the Anglo-Americans just really couldn't wrap their mind around this. They said, well, if they have such close relationships with people of color, they're probably just all people of color. And so white Creoles in the mid to late 19th century, at first, they just said, oh, those Americans, what can you do about them? They just don't really understand the culture here. But things start to take a more kind of desperate turn as you have the rise of extremely violent white supremacy, the rise of the White League in the 1870s, and just a very kind of virulent white supremacist racism and violence. It becomes, really a matter of almost life and death for white Creoles to be really clear that they're white and only white, of course, right? Because within Anglo-American context, any hint of anyone, even in your genealogy, being a person of African descent is going to become problematic. Just to reinforce that, in my interviews, I had some white respondents who would swear me to secrecy when they said that there was potentially a person of African descent in their genealogy in the early 19th century, right? So 200 years ago, they were that sensitive to word getting out that there was or might have been a person of African descent 200 years ago, all right? And that's in the early 21st century. So you can only imagine in the 1880s, the sense of urgency to make it really clear if you were white and Creole that you were really white and that you weren't, kind of just passing as white. So this all kind of came to a head in 1880, 1881 with the publishing of a novel called The Grandissimes. And it was bought by an Anglo-American named George Washington Cable. So Cable was, a bit of a social critic. And so even though it's a novel, it's really a critical commentary on Creole society. And so he does something very interesting. It came out as a serial. That is, it was published in newspapers, small sections over time, and then it was bound together as a book in the early 1880s. So I put a picture here from the book, which is from the beginning of the book, and it's a masquerade ball. And it's really very clever that he starts out with a masquerade ball, because it is to his point. And his point is, you don't really know who is who amongst Creoles. So it's set in this kind of high Creole society. Different people at the masquerade ball get mistaken. Was that so-and-so or was that so-and-so? And the way that the novel is set up, it's set up to deliberately deceive the reader as to who is who and racially what is going on. So I won't spoil the whole thing just in case you want to read it, but suffice it to say that there is a character named Honoré de Grandissime who is not who he seems to be. And I will leave it at that. But there's about a good 1/3 of the novel where I was very confused, and anyone would be very confused, because Cable deliberately plays some games on you that are meant to kind of mock the Creoles. So the press in New Orleans has very different positions on this, depending on whether it's the French press or the English press. So here's an excerpt from the New Orleans Item, which was an English-speaking paper. We doubt whether this book, in spite of its delicate merit, will become a favorite with residents of the Creole city. Its paintings are not always flattering to native eyes. Its evocation of dead memories will not be found pleasing. So Anglo-American said, we know the Creoles are not going to like this, even though we think there's a lot of truth in it. Then if we switch over to L'Abeille, which was a French language newspaper, they are very upset. There's not one of us who remembers him, that is, having met him, Cable, the author, at a salon. This population of color, which he describes with such aplomb, he knows not the least thing about them. Moreover, this analyst who makes himself out to be knowledgeable about a society for which French was the usual language during the time he writes about, does not understand even a word of French. And so basically they determine, they dismiss Cable, they're very offended. But unfortunately for the Creoles, the Grandissimes is spectacularly successful across the country. And so it just reinforces this picture of the Creoles as being thoroughly racially mixed, not really white, and also being hypocritical and treating Black people very badly, even though they are related to them. So the book spans quite a lot of time. It begins in the late 18th, early 19th century with the refugees, tracks them through the 19th century, and then I do interviews with the descendants. So most of the interviews are with descendants of that migration from colonial Saint-Domingue, but in the case of white interviewees, I also had to add in people who were white and who identified as having Creole heritage, even if they weren't descendants. And the reason was because so many white Louisianans got rid of or submerged their Creole identity, because to say that one was white and Creole was an oxymoron to so many people that they just stopped identifying as Creole altogether. And so it was very, very hard to find that experience. And so I had to supplement. So I did 19 semi-structured interviews with white Louisianans, and these 7 oral histories were with people who may not have been descendant from Saint-Domingue, but who shared a lot of the experiences because they came from white Creole families in the 19th century. And in those oral histories, I kind of teased out, what their experience, what their family's experience was with being white and Creole. So with William Connick, in this example, you get a sense of, how well into the 20th century and even up until today, to be white and to say that one was Creole pretty much amounted to one saying that one was not white in the eyes of Anglo-Americans. So he explains, I had one of my grandmother's sisters, maybe when she got married, she married a guy from Baltimore who was up in society, I think a little bit, and she always called herself a Creole. Well, they mistook that up there to mean she might have had some Negro blood in her. So I think that caused some prejudice against her. Here's another example of a woman who grew up in the mid to late 19th century, and she's white and also identifies as Creole. I remember when I was in the first grade, I told a little boy that I was Creole, and he said, well, you are a in. And he used the bad word in the first grade, and I cried about it. I was embarrassed, but what he meant was that he had grown up in his family hearing that what Creole meant. And so I couldn't understand because I had been brought up with that term with such a sense of pride, knowing who my ancestors were. So she was brought up in her white family, with a sense of Creole as having French heritage, from Spanish or French background, Catholic, and so on, certain kind of cuisine. And this little boy, all he heard when he heard Creole was someone who was Black. Angelique Bergeron has another very interesting example of, what it's meant trying to identify as both Creole and white in Louisiana. I remember going to a Creole Heritage Center conference, and I couldn't find a single Creole speaker, but everybody that I went up to and told I was Creole understood that I was mixed race. And I wasn't trying to say that. I was trying to say that I was Creole. My family's Creole, we're French, and I didn't realize that other people had that other association with it until I was confronted with it. I remember this man, and I talked to him for a long time, and he said, wow, you're really fair. And he said something about my hair or something, and I was like, oh, I'm white Creole. He just looked at me funny. So what's interesting here is that Angelique actually still speaks Creole, which is very unusual. The Creole language has not survived very well. So she's white, she speaks Creole. She was at an event that was largely Creoles of color who did not speak Creole, but there was this sense that there was literally no space for her to be both white and to legitimately identify with being Creole at the same time. I'm going to switch over to the situation of people of color, so people of African descent who were also Creole and what their struggle was. And so this is a repeat of that quote that I started out with, right? And so what Benjamin Morgan is saying is, so what are we going to do with these, free people of African descent? If we don't treat them well, then they're going to kind of identify with the larger group of enslaved Black people. And so you see in his mind and in the mind of most people, there was a difference between these people of African descent who were free and the larger group of enslaved people who were not as likely to be mixed race who were not free. And so it's this big question of, what will their role be in our society? And it was a question precisely because as an Anglo-American, Benjamin Morgan is an agent of the government, and Anglo-Americans just don't have a social category for free people of African descent. And so this was why it was such a quandary for them. So in terms of the struggle to find their place in the 19th century, we see here a little bit of a breakdown in what they try to do right after the purchase. So 55 free men of color petitioned the new governor, Governor Claiborne, to allow them to continue to serve in the militia as they had already been doing. The Americans did not want them to do that because they were very nervous with the idea of people of African descent with guns. So this was, standard practice in Louisiana, in colonial Saint-Domingue, with the Anglo-Americans and their view of race and Black people. This was not possible. But by 1806, Claiborne relents and recommends the militia allow participation of free men of color. In 1806, free people of color are addressed in the Black codes where they're forbidden to strike, or if they fail to show deference to a white person, they can have negative consequences. So you're starting to see how they're being lumped in together with a larger Black population. 1812, free men of color are finally able to participate in battle against the British. 1816, restricted access to public accommodation for free people of color, where again, you're starting to see that they're losing rights that they had, and they're being more and more lumped with Black Americans. And then in 1820, omnibus lines are segregated to exclude free people of color. So this was part of their struggle, was to say, well, we're free, we're legally free, so why should we be treated differently than white citizens? But Anglo-Americans continually putting them in a place of unfreedom and restriction. So this kind of contrast between free people of color who are Creole and people who are Anglo-American and Black is really encapsulated in the difference between these two Black leaders. Du Bois, I'm sure that most of you are probably familiar with him. He's a very prominent African-American leader, late 19th century into the 20th century. Rodolphe Lucien Desdunes is probably someone that you are not so familiar with. He was a very, very active Creole of color in 19th century New Orleans. He did a lot of work with others in the 19th century who were working on the 19th century New Orleans version of the civil rights movement. They did a lot of great work. It was people who were in the same social circles as Desdunes who actually brought the Plessy case to the Supreme Court, and who set up all of, everything. Was basically very similar to what happened with Rosa Parks, is what Desdunes and his collaborators did. And the kind of French and Creole background of that Plessy case is something that is often completely overlooked in its teaching. It's very interesting that way. So Desdunes reads something by Du Bois. Du Bois had published a piece in a national newspaper saying that, Black Americans needed to be better educated, that they were so far behind, and, that ignorance was a bad thing, and that post-emancipation, we needed more of a focus on education. So Desdunes happens to read this, and he takes great exception, because he says, not all Black people are in the same category. And he's thinking here of the situation of Creoles of color who are descended from free people of color. So he says, there are two distinct schools of politics among the Negroes. The Latin Negro differs radically from the Anglo-Saxon in aspiration and method. One hopes, the other doubts. Thus, we often perceive that one makes every effort to acquire merits, the other to gain advantages. One aspires to equality, the other to identity. One will forget that he is a Negro in order to think that he is a man. The other will forget that he is a man in order to think that he is a Negro. One is a philosophical Negro, the other practical. So what's interesting here is he is drawing a very clear distinction between Creoles of color and Black Americans. And it's a distinction that you often see to this day between people of African descent who are immigrants to the United States and who draw very clear contrast between themselves and African Americans. So I think you see some of the precursor of that in the 19th century with Desdunes and many Creoles of color. So this part of the research, I also did semi-structured interviews and oral histories with Creoles of color. And I found that they took three major racial pathways. So to compare them with the white Creoles, most white Creoles just blended into being white Americans. And, that's why I had to take special effort to find white Louisianans who would say that they had any Creole heritage, because that has really been, kind of taken out of many of them because of the ways that's been received amongst other white people. So they've suppressed being Creole. Creoles of color have taken three different kinds of responses. At least that's what I found. So the one is embracing Anglo-Blackness. So Stephanie says, Black American denotes I'm native, not an immigrant. Some people don't accept that they're Black. I'm not trying to deny it. When I was a kid, there was the one drop rule. I think Black is a state of mind, what you think you are. I prefer and am comfortable with saying that I'm Black. Barbara Trevine also says, race does matter. As much as we say we're Creole and we want a Creole organization, we want this, that, and the other, we don't want to be labeled, but race does matter. Because the United States is controlled by Anglo-white males, race does matter because we are governed by white males. Now, so the Anglo-Blackness, so basically identifying as Black Americans, was one path. another was passing or being pushed into a kind of Anglo-American view of whiteness and identifying as white. So this one, Mark Rudenay, if you look at him visually, he looks completely white. He grew up as white, but then he found something very shocking. He says, I was stunned. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I do remember feeling pride in discovering anything about my past because my father never talked about his father. He was never really raised by his father. So to find out anything, I was very proud, but also stunned to learn that I came from a Creole past in New Orleans. At that point, I understood that my great-great-grandfather was mixed race, Black and white, Creole and Afro-Creole. So all of a sudden, questions came up in my mind. What does that make me? My initial reaction was pride, but also a sense of, well, what am I? So he grows up as white, basically he's pushed into being white by his father's decision. He now identifies as Creole. And so, that's been very much a big adjustment for him. So the next one, very similar, Pat Scheck-Snyder, who went on to actually found an organization of Creoles of color, but she too was raised as white. Now, what's interesting in her case is that to look at her, you would assume she's a light-skinned Black woman if you're looking at her through an Anglo-American lens. But in New Orleans, where race has been long very different, I think this is where there's evidence of a palimpsest that, yes, the Anglo-American system of doing race is dominant, but you still have this remembrance and this cultural memory and practice of the French and the Spanish ways of doing race that are Creole. And so there's still room for people to look Black in ways that phenotypically they'd be thought of as Black in other parts of the US, but raised as white. So it's really fascinating. So she also got a surprise learning that her family had passed as white a generation ago. So when they found out, she said, we just ate it up. It was an incredible thing. I called my daughter at LSU, and she's the one who truly helped me in the beginning to do the research. We made a plan and we started with one family at a time. It quickly became more. We uncovered my mother's family pretty thoroughly on both sides. My grandparents were both Creoles and my mother is Creole, but my grandparents made a decision that my mother attend a white school, the French Union School, then public school. That said to me, this is their decision for their children. Interestingly enough, my father, I don't think he was aware of his past. He was raised as a white person. So the third path was challenging and resisting the Anglo-American racial framework. So rather than saying, okay, I'm Black or okay, I'm white, these are people who refused to choose one. So Nija says, I guess I realize all of the mixtures inside of me. The French, of course, African-American, the Creoles, whatever that is, and I'm often asked where I am from. So I guess I must look quite mixed or confusing to people, and I'm Caribbean looking, and I could be from Jamaica or anywhere down in that area of the world. And I just realized how much New Orleans people are mixed up. So all of this started to unfold for me very early on in the research. In 2003, I was at a conference put on by Creoles of Color in New Orleans. And what was interesting there is that the speakers were drawing parallels between their own experience as Creoles of Color and people of Latinx background here in the United States. And they said, people who are Hispanic, they seem to be dealing with something very similar to what we're dealing with, where the Anglo-American racial system doesn't really fit. All right. And there's this tension between this Anglo-American and this Latin Caribbean approach to race. So just to give examples of this, so these are quotes from people who recently immigrated. Maria Martins is a Brazilian who for 30 years before immigrating to the United States looked in the mirror and saw a morena, a woman with caramel-colored skin that is nearly equated with whiteness in Brazil and some other Latin American countries. I didn't realize I was Black until I came here, she said. Similarly, Jose Neinstein, a native white Brazilian, boiled it down to the simplest terms. In this country, the United States, he said, if you are not quite white, then you are Black. But in Brazil, he said, if you are not quite Black, then you are white. And other similar experiences, Katia Mendez says, I'm not Black and I'm not white, so don't define ourselves that way. So I would choose some other race on the census. And Nelly de la Rosa, we have so much mixture. These other census categories just don't reflect who we are. So to come back and to kind of wrap up, when I started, I said that I'm making this argument that the idea of the racial palimpsest is a more useful concept than what is standard in sociology. So right now, for scholars who are thinking about the significance of immigration, particularly people from Latin America and the Caribbean or other people of color, they're asking these questions about, well, maybe the color line is transitioning. So they're trying to make sense of the fact that those of a Latinx background often don't feel at home in the kind of standard Black-white categories. And so one theory is that we're in a current transition from one color line to another, instead of from a Black-white color line, maybe to one that is going to look somewhat different. Lee and Bean and Marrow suggest maybe we're moving from a Black-white to a Black non-Black, so that you have Blacks on one side who continue to be stigmatized, and then everyone else essentially who is even if they're not white, they're kind of maybe given an honorary status as being nearly white. Bonilla Silva suggests that maybe there's a triracial where it's white, honorary white, and Black. And what I'm arguing with the racial palimpsest concept is that we can't really have one idea that fits the whole country. We need things that are regionally specific and historically grounded. So the analysis that you use for Miami or New Orleans will not be the one that you will use for parts of Minnesota or Madison in Wisconsin. So the takeaway here, I think, is that region and history absolutely matter. That if we're trying to understand race and the significance of race, we have to look to region and regional history. We have to know that the foundational racial system is tenacious. That is, it's not something that can easily change. So even though we have lots of immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean, that foundational racial system in an area is likely to stay very active and very influential over a very long time. So we see that in New Orleans, in the case that even though the Louisiana Purchase was 200 years ago, there are still aspects of that Latin Caribbean system that continue to influence the way people think about and inhabit racial and cultural categories. And to understand that there's people engage in a strategic navigation of the rules for multiple racial systems. So they, in a place like New Orleans, and I would say also Miami, they are conversant in the Anglo-American system, and they're conversant in various Latin Caribbean systems. And depending on who they're with, they will engage in strategic action according to the rules of that racial system. And then finally, just a caution that greater flexibility in one kind of racial system or another does not necessarily equate to less racism. That is, that anti-Blackness tends to prevail whatever the racial system is. And work for anti-racism and racial justice has to adapt to regional racial histories and the presence of racial palimpsest. And that is it.
Thank you, Dr. Parham. That was great. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I've put in the chat that you're more than welcome to unmute and turn on your camera if you like, or you can put your question in the chat and I can read it aloud. I will say, Dr. Parham, there was a little drama on the University of Mississippi campus. It's not as bad as I make it sound. There was an outage, like a power outage. And so we lost Dr. Pasadomo and Dr. McKee really early on. I see a new colleague I have not met in person, but Sarah Rodriguez was on and then left and then is back. So that's great. So that may have happened to a few people.
Okay.
Don't be shy. Even if we don't have a question, we can take a comment. I want to say this is a first.
I have a question or comment.
Thank you, Rondalyn.
So I have a lot of relatives in Louisiana and South Mississippi. And so I've been in and around the city a lot. And one thing that somebody would call me right when I'm asking a question, sorry. One of the things that's interesting to me is kind of this what you call this kind of reassertion of Creole identity. And I'm wondering, are there particular reasons why? Because I guess in the very last part of the last century and the very first part of this century, you know, older Black Creoles, African Creoles were still very much identifying as Black people. And now it seems like maybe they're not.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I have to wonder if it might have something to do with the fact that 2000 was the year that the census allowed for multiple racial categories. And so there was kind of a national conversation about this idea that you didn't have to just be pushed into one racial category. And I know there were some, even some Creoles in some conversations that I was part of who were wondering, should we try for a Creole category? Like, is that something that could be a thing? So I didn't get to go into it, but in the book, I talk about the fact that there were, I do say that there are 3 different Creole paths that I saw for Creoles of color. There were people in the late 19th, early 20th century, Creoles of color. It was very common to just have very, very clear boundaries between Black people and Creoles. And, I'd say probably the majority would not have seen themselves as being Black, but would have seen themselves as being Creole. And they kept that Creole identity well into the 20th century, but the 60s in particular, the 60s and the 70s marked a very big transition with the rise of Black power, Black empowerment, Black is beautiful. In the student papers of Xavier University in New Orleans during this time, there's which was kind of like a historic Creole of color university. Many people from that background went there. But you see many of those students in the 60s and 70s saying, no, we are Black. And we are unapologetically Black. We have to stop distinguishing ourselves from Black Americans. And so some of my interviewees said that was during the time that they de-identified as Creole, that they became almost embarrassed to be identified as Creole, because to identify as Creole was seen as, rejecting one's Blackness. But some of those same people then in the early 2000s have come back to re-identifying as Creole. And for them, it's kind of a process of just having more of a sense of confidence. And as they re-identify as Creole, they still see themselves as Black Americans. That is, they see a space to be both. Whereas before it was kind of this either or, they're saying, well, yes, I identify with the Black majority, but culturally I'm Creole. And, there's no reason I should have to reject that, it's an ethnic identity. So I think the kind of the politics of the country have really shaped the way Creoles have identified or not identified.
Thanks for that answer. I happen to be a census taker in 2020. The 2000 and the 2020 census. And so having to go around and ask people about their identities, and the fact that a lot of other groups want ethnic identities that are not Latinx actually, on the census. The Arab Americans had a really, they were really up in arms about that this past time. It's like, we're other or we're white, but I want you to know that I'm Arab. Right. That's what I want you to know. So it sounds like we need also a Creole category. We're going to have a lot of ethnic categories.
Yes.
Thank you, Rondalyn. I have a question that we've received from Robert Sarnio, who is our University Museum Director. Robert wants to better understand the Desdunes-Du Bois matter. What was it that Du Bois was saying that Desdunes reacted to? He didn't quite catch it, and he apologizes for that. Did the two end up in a public dialogue and interchange?
I could not find any evidence of a public dialogue and interchange. Unfortunately, I really wish I could have. So Du Bois wrote this piece, I think it was a 1907 piece. And what he was arguing, I don't have the text in front of me, but essentially what he was saying is that Black Americans as a whole were not very well educated, and that more resources needed to be put into educating Black Americans and kind of bringing them up to speed educationally. And so what Desdunes was responding to was what he saw as a kind of blanket representation of Blackness as uneducated or undereducated. And so what he was at pains to say in this rather long pamphlet that he wrote in response to Du Bois, I mean, it's long. He basically gives like a whole history of Creoles of color in Louisiana and in colonial Saint-Domingue. You know, he brings out Toussaint Louverture and all sorts of other people. And he's like, I don't know who you're talking about, because we've been educated and mobilized and, you know, French and English speaking and literate for generations. You're not really talking about us. You need to have a better understanding of, you know, the history, the varied history of Black people. And so that is where Desdunes is coming from. So again, I didn't see any. Du Bois's article was public. It was in a national newspaper. Desdunes' response as a pamphlet, I believe it was published in New Orleans. It was written in English, but it does not seem to me like it would be the kind of thing that was widely circulated outside of New Orleans. You know, Du Bois's was a very short, pithy article, or actually it was a speech he had given in New York City that was reprinted in the newspaper. So I don't know that there was any kind of public engagement, or at least I couldn't find it. But Desdunes was basically saying there was a difference between the Anglo-American Black person and the Latin Caribbean Black person.
Thank you so much.
We have time for one more. While you all are thinking about it, I'm gonna just drop the 2 upcoming events in our chat. Again, one on Sunday in the Grove. It's the Sarah Fest Punk pop-up, film screening and concert. And then next Wednesday, another virtual self-talk with Dr. Ethel Skurlock and Disha Filyal, discussing Disha Filyal's book, Race and the Secret Lives of Church Ladies. All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Parham. This has been great. It was recorded, so we will be sure to share it with you as well as with our campus community.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I hope all is well there and continues to be well.
Same to you. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.